She was just a little girl in a blue dress, crying on the steps of a dance school. He was a billionaire in a suit who almost walked past until 4 words changed all their lives forever. It was an overcast Thursday afternoon in early spring, when Andrew Carter found himself walking down a quiet neighborhood street on the outskirts of Seattle. He wasn't supposed to be there. His driver had taken a wrong turn, and instead of heading straight to the office for another meeting with investors, Andrew had asked to be dropped off a few blocks away. He said he needed air. The truth was, he needed silence, the kind that doesn't ask questions or expect answers. He walked with his hands in the pockets of his light gray suit. His expensive shoes made little sound on the damp pavement. Andrew looked every bit the man the world thought he was: confident, polished, untouchable. But inside he was a shell of the man he used to be. His wife, Lily, had died just 8 months ago after a brutal fight with cancer. Since then, Andrew had mastered the art of functioning without living. He filled his calendar with meetings, launched new divisions of his company, and smiled at all the right cameras. But his house was silent, his heart even more so. He passed a modest dance studio tucked between a laundromat and a deli. It wasn't the kind of place he would normally notice. There were no big windows, no fancy branding, just a chalkboard sign outside that read, "Father-Daughter Dance. Today, 5 p.m. He barely registered it until he saw her. She was sitting alone on the steps in front of the building, her small hands folded in her lap. Blonde hair pulled into a tidy bun with a bright blue ribbon, wearing a delicate sky blue dress that shimmered faintly in the weak light. Her white ballet shoes were scuffed, and her posture was too still for a child her age. Andrew slowed instinctively. There was something about her, the way her eyes stared at the ground, as if it had let her down, that made him stop. He hesitated, unsure if approaching her would frighten her or invite trouble. But as he stepped a little closer, she looked up. Her eyes were the color of the sea just before a storm, blue, clear but heavy with emotion. She didn't flinch, she didn't ask who he was. Instead, with a voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it, she said, "It's the daddy dance, and I don't have one." Her words hit him like a punch to the chest. There was no dramatics in her tone, just simple truth. And somehow, that made it even harder to bear. Andrew crouched down slowly, lowering himself to her level. His knees cracked, reminding him that he wasn't young anymore. But in that moment, something inside him, the part that had been numb for months, shifted. He looked into her eyes and, without even thinking, said, "Then I'll be your dad, for the dance." There was no dramatic music, no crowd watching. Just a girl with a broken hope and a man with a broken heart, meeting in the middle of an ordinary sidewalk, changing both their lives without even realizing it. Sophie Brooks was finishing her 10th night shift in a row at the downtown hospital when her phone buzzed with a message from her neighbor. It simply read, "Emma had a great time at the dance, she'll tell you everything. Also, you might want to ask her about the man in the gray suit." The message puzzled her, but there was no time to respond. She was already late picking up her daughter. Her body ached in ways she'd stopped trying to describe. The hospital floor had been chaos all night, emergency codes, alarms, patients crying, doctors snapping. She'd become used to functioning under constant pressure, but some days it hit harder than others. Today was one of those days. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on her shoulders as she drove home in her beat-up Honda Civic, the backseat still full of old toys and scrubs she hadn't washed in a week. Emma was waiting for her in the neighbor's living room, curled up on the couch with a juice box in one hand and a plastic tiara in the other. She looked radiant, glowing in a way Sophie hadn't seen in what felt like forever. Her little blue dress had glitter across the skirt, and her cheeks were still slightly pink from exertion. Sophie knelt down, brushing a lock of hair from her daughter's forehead, and asked gently, "Did you have fun, sweetheart?" Emma nodded furiously and began to speak all at once, the words tumbling over each other like an overflowing faucet. It was amazing. There were lights and music and cookies and lemonade, and we all got to twirl and do spins, and Mommy, he picked me. Sophie blinked. "Who picked you?" Emma beamed. "The man in the suit, the gray one. He saw me sitting alone and I told him I didn't have a daddy to dance with, and then he said he'd be mine. Just for the dance." Sophie froze for a second. A strange tightness bloomed in her chest. Her first instinct was panic. Who was this man? Why had a stranger danced with her daughter? Why had no one called her? Her mind jumped to headlines and horror stories, but then she looked again at Emma's face. There was no fear in her daughter's eyes, only wonder, the kind of wonder Sophie hadn't seen in her for so long, not since everything changed. After thanking the neighbor, Sophie drove Emma home, listening carefully to every detail. Emma told the story like it was a fairy tale. The man had brown hair and the kindest blue eyes, she said. He helped her tie her ribbon when it came loose and showed her how to spin without falling. He didn't talk down to her or make her feel like she was just a little kid. He called her Miss Emma, and even gave her a rose from the refreshment table. Sophie tucked Emma into bed that night with her heart caught between two emotions, relief and unease. Relief because for the first time in months, her daughter had felt seen and special. Unease because she didn't know who this man was or what he wanted. She lay in bed afterward staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house. She hadn't expected to raise a child alone. Emma's father had left 3 years ago, shortly after Emma's 3rd birthday, without warning or explanation. One morning he kissed Sophie on the cheek, packed a bag, and simply never returned. The mortgage, the bills, the daycare fees, all of it had come crashing down on Sophie's shoulders, and she had carried it ever since, silently, determined never to show her daughter just how hard things had become. The next morning, while Emma was eating cereal, she showed Sophie a photo on the neighbor's phone. The man in the gray suit was kneeling next to her, holding her hand, both of them mid-laugh. The image hit Sophie in the gut. Not just because he was handsome, though he was, but because he looked like he genuinely cared. There was something soft in the way he looked at Emma, something unforced. He hadn't posed for the camera, he hadn't faked a smile, he was just present. Sophie couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her daughter that way. Still, she couldn't let her guard down. She asked the neighbor for his name. "Andrew Carter," the neighbor replied, as if that should mean something. Sophie's brows knit together. The name sounded familiar. Later that day, during her lunch break at the hospital, she Googled it. What she found made her sit down. Andrew Carter was the CEO of one of the most powerful tech companies on the West Coast. Forbes called him one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. He had given keynote speeches at Silicon Valley conferences and appeared on magazine covers. But his most recent photo was different. It was taken at his wife's funeral. The caption read, "Tech giant says goodbye to beloved wife after battle with cancer." In the photo, he looked 10 years older, hollow, worn. Sophie stared at the screen for a long time. The man who had knelt beside her daughter wasn't just a stranger, he was someone the world saw as untouchable, larger than life. And yet, he had seen Emma sitting alone on a dance school step, and instead of walking past like everyone else, he'd stopped. That night, when Emma asked if she might see Daddy Andrew again, Sophie didn't have an answer, but something deep inside her shifted. For the first time in years, she wondered not just if she could survive, but if she might one day hope for more. Andrew Carter had never felt more unsure of himself than when he stood outside the modest townhouse on 18th Street, holding a bouquet of simple white daisies. It wasn't the kind of place he usually visited. He was used to penthouse boardrooms, polished marble lobbies, sleek restaurants with valet parking. But here, in this quiet, slightly worn neighborhood with cracked sidewalks and children's bikes strewn across front lawns, he felt more out of place than ever. And yet, he stayed. He had called the neighbor from the dance studio, explaining who he was, and asked if she might pass along his number to Emma's mother. He wasn't even sure what he'd been hoping for, an awkward thank you maybe, or a polite brush-off. Instead, 3 days later, he received a text from a number he didn't recognize. It was short and cautious. "Emma would like to thank you in person. Saturday afternoon, 3 p.m. He hadn't expected a response, let alone an invitation, and now, standing here with his heart racing like a teenager's, he felt foolish for caring so much. He knocked twice, not too loud, and after a moment, the door opened to reveal the girl who had changed everything. Emma grinned the moment she saw him. "You came," she said, throwing her arms around his waist before he had time to react. She was wearing a soft yellow t-shirt with a unicorn on it, her hair down and a bit messy, and she looked up at him with complete trust. Behind her stood her mother. Sophie Brooks wasn't what he had expected. She looked tired but not weak. Her face carried the quiet strength of someone who had seen too much and kept going anyway. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, and her eyes, calm but wary, met his with cautious curiosity. She wore simple jeans and a sweatshirt, and somehow, she was still striking in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or polish. She didn't smile right away, and Andrew didn't blame her. He was a stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and danced with her daughter. Her caution made sense. "Hi," he said, offering the flowers. "I brought these, for Emma, or you, or both. Honestly, I wasn't sure." Sophie took them gently and gave a small, reserved smile. "Thanks," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he replied, suddenly feeling like he was 12 years old. "But I wanted to." She led him inside. The home was small, cozy, lived in. There were drawings taped to the fridge, a pair of tiny ballet shoes by the door, and a bookshelf filled with a mix of children's stories and nursing textbooks. The furniture didn't match, but everything was clean and warm. He noticed a framed photo of Emma as a baby next to a stack of unopened mail and utility bills. It was a home built on effort, not money. Emma dragged him by the hand into the living room, insisting he sit down and see her newest drawing. As she told him about school and her favorite snacks, Andrew listened, truly listened, for the first time in weeks. Something about her voice, unfiltered and free, soothed something jagged inside him. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, she just wanted to share the things she loved with someone who would listen. Sophie sat across from him, watching quietly at first. She was polite but guarded. Eventually, as Emma skipped off to get her sticker book, she finally spoke. "I just want to be clear," she began. "I appreciate what you did for Emma, truly. You gave her something she'll never forget. But I don't know you, and I have to protect her, always." Andrew nodded immediately. "I get that. I would feel exactly the same. I didn't come here to make things complicated. I didn't plan any of this. That day, I just saw a little girl who reminded me of something I lost, and I couldn't walk away." Sophie's expression softened just slightly. "Your wife," she said quietly. He looked at her, surprised, and then nodded. "Yeah, she died 8 months ago. Cancer. We didn't have kids, we wanted them, but time ran out." There was a silence between them, not awkward but heavy. Shared loss has a way of leveling people, no matter how different their lives might be. Sophie looked down at her hands. "Emma's dad left when she was 3. No note, no goodbye. I thought I was prepared for that possibility, but when it actually happened, I haven't really trusted anyone since." Andrew leaned forward slightly, not to convince her of anything, but simply to be closer. "You don't have to trust me, not yet, or ever if that's what you decide. I just want to be around if Emma ever wants to talk or draw or spin in circles until she falls over. She's kind of amazing." Sophie let out the smallest laugh, unexpected but real. "She is," she said. "And exhausting." They talked a little more after that. Nothing too deep. Favorite books, what Emma liked to eat, how Sophie managed night shifts while raising a child alone. Andrew offered no pity, only curiosity, and Sophie, for reasons she couldn't explain, found herself answering honestly. He didn't make her feel small or pitied, he just made her feel like someone who hadn't been seen in a long time. When he finally stood to leave, Emma clung to his arm. "Will you come again?" she asked, eyes wide with hope. Andrew crouched to meet her gaze. "Only if your mom says it's okay," he said. Sophie didn't answer right away, but as Emma looked up at her with that pleading, unguarded face, she gave a quiet nod. Outside, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft gold, Andrew walked back to his car feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, like maybe the pieces of his broken world were slowly beginning to rearrange themselves into something new. Something worth hoping for. It had been 3 months since the dance, and in that time, something unspoken but undeniable had begun to grow between Andrew, Sophie, and Emma. What started as an act of kindness had turned into a regular part of their lives. Sunday afternoons at the park, movie nights with popcorn spilled all over the couch, Emma running to the door whenever the doorbell rang, hoping it would be him. Sophie had started smiling more. Not wide, easy smiles, like she used to give in another life, but soft, quiet ones that crept into the corners of her mouth when she wasn't watching. Andrew never overstepped. He never tried to replace anyone. He simply showed up, fully and without expectation. And Emma, who once carried a quiet sadness in her little frame, now walked a bit taller. But peace never lasted long in Sophie's world. One late afternoon, as she was walking out of the hospital, her phone rang with a number she hadn't seen in years. At first, she thought it was a mistake, then she froze. It was him, Derek, Emma's biological father. His voice was casual, almost smug, as if no time had passed. "Hey Soph, I've been thinking, I want to see my daughter." Sophie nearly dropped the phone, her mind went white-hot with a mix of rage and fear. He hadn't called in over 3 years, no birthday cards, no child support, not even a text, just silence, like she and Emma had never existed. She managed to steady her voice enough to say, "You don't get to call her your daughter, you gave that up the day you walked out." But Derek wasn't rattled. In fact, he seemed amused. "I heard you've been keeping some fancy company. CEO guy, right? What's his name? Carter. Must be nice, all that money floating around. Makes me wonder if maybe I should start thinking about my rights again." That's when she understood. He didn't care about Emma, he cared about control, about power, about money. Sophie hung up without another word, her hands trembling so hard she had to sit down on the curb outside the hospital. Her first instinct was to protect Emma, but her second was pure dread. Derek had always been good at slipping through cracks, using charm when it suited him, manipulation when it didn't. And if he really meant to fight for custody or even visitation, he would find a way to make their lives hell. She called Andrew that night, not to panic, not to unload, but because she didn't want to face it alone. He arrived at her door 20 minutes later, still in a blazer, tie loosened, eyes serious. She told him everything, Derek's sudden call, his tone, his words, his threat. She expected Andrew to get angry or try to fix it with money or connections, but he didn't. He simply sat beside her on the couch and said, "Whatever happens, you're not doing it alone, we'll fight this together." Emma was asleep in the next room, unaware of the storm about to hit. Sophie watched her daughter's chest rise and fall with each peaceful breath and knew that she couldn't allow that peace to be stolen. But she also knew Derek wouldn't go away quietly. 2 weeks later, she received an official letter in the mail. Derek had filed for joint custody. The wording was slick, manipulative, claiming he had been denied access, that he was seeking to repair a long-lost bond. Sophie felt sick just reading it. He didn't even know what Emma liked to eat, let alone what she dreamed of at night. The legal process began quickly: meetings, paperwork, court dates. Andrew offered his full support, standing beside her through it all, bringing coffee to early hearings, sitting silently beside her in waiting rooms when words weren't enough. The worst part was explaining it to Emma. Sophie chose her words carefully, keeping her voice calm even though her heart was beating wildly. "Sweetheart," she began, kneeling beside her daughter, "there's something we have to talk about. Someone from before wants to see you, someone who used to be here when you were very little." Emma frowned, clearly confused. "Who?" "Your biological dad," Sophie said gently. "His name is Derek. He's asking the court if he can be a part of your life again." Emma was silent for a long time, her small face unreadable. Then she whispered, "Do I have to?" Sophie pulled her into her arms. "We're going to do everything we can so you don't have to do anything you're not ready for. You're not alone in this." That night, when Sophie tucked her in, Emma clutched her hand and asked, "Will Andrew still be my dad if this other man comes back?" Sophie's throat tightened. She hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead, afraid of what she might not be able to promise. But she said the only thing she knew was true. "Andrew loves you, that doesn't change no matter what." The days that followed were filled with legal tension and emotional exhaustion. Derek was smug in the courtroom, dressing the part of a reformed man, spinning stories about regret and redemption. But he underestimated one thing: Emma. When the judge requested a private session with the child, to hear her feelings, Emma walked into that room with all the quiet strength of her mother, and the steady grounding Andrew had helped her find. Later, Sophie and Andrew would learn what Emma had said from the court-appointed child psychologist. She had spoken softly, but clearly. "My real dad is the one who danced with me when I was sad. He didn't leave, he showed up. That's the kind of dad I want." Sophie cried when she heard that. Not just because of the words, but because it came from a little girl who had every reason to feel abandoned by the world, yet had somehow found the courage to choose love. The custody petition was denied. Derek had no legal rights and no standing, and the court made it clear that forcing a relationship on a child who didn't want it was not in her best interest. When they returned home that evening, exhausted but victorious, Emma ran straight into Andrew's arms and whispered, "You're still my dance dad, right?" He lifted her up without hesitation. "Always," he said. And for the first time in what felt like years, Sophie let herself believe that maybe the worst was finally behind them. The weeks that followed the court's decision were a strange blend of exhaustion and quiet relief. Sophie felt as if she'd been holding her breath for years and had finally exhaled, but even now, with the judge's ruling behind them and Derek legally out of the picture, a part of her couldn't stop bracing for another blow. Trauma teaches you to expect that the good moments are only borrowed time. But still, there was something undeniably different now. The shadow that had loomed over her family for so long had begun to recede. Emma was sleeping better. She no longer woke up crying from dreams she didn't understand, no longer asked whether someone else might try to come and take her away. Instead, she bounced out of bed every morning with her usual energy, braiding her doll's hair and asking when Andrew would visit again. Their bond had only grown stronger. He was the one she ran to with her drawings, the one she demanded push her higher on the swings, the one who sat with her when she tried to read big words aloud, cheering at every small success like it was a championship win. Sophie noticed the way Andrew had become a fixture in their lives, not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, through steady presence. He was there for Sunday dinners, helping to carry groceries, sitting with Sophie late into the evening after Emma had gone to bed. They talked about everything, childhoods, losses, dreams they hadn't admitted out loud in years. There was no need to impress one another. The masks they both wore in their separate, polished worlds had quietly slipped away. One late evening Sophie found herself standing at the kitchen sink, staring out at the backyard where Andrew and Emma were building a lopsided birdhouse. She watched as he held the tiny wooden pieces together and let Emma hammer the nails, even when she bent two of them completely sideways. He didn't correct her or sigh in frustration, he just smiled, adjusted the pieces, and tried again. That image, Andrew, patient and present, covered in wood glue and laughter, brought something to life in her chest that she'd buried for years. Not just affection, not just gratitude, love, not the cautious, maybe someday love she thought she might find again, but something truer, solid, earned. She was still staring when he came inside, arms full of paintbrushes and wood shavings, Emma skipping behind him. He grinned, his hair a mess, a smudge of blue paint on his jaw. "We've created a masterpiece," he said, "and possibly violated several safety codes." Emma held up the birdhouse like it was a trophy, beaming. Sophie laughed, then paused, her voice quieter than expected. "Thank you, for all of this, for her." Andrew shrugged lightly, as if it was nothing. "You don't have to thank me." "I do," Sophie said, her eyes meeting his. "Because you chose us, when you didn't have to." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at her, really looked past the tired eyes and worn-out sweatshirt, past the months of fear and caution, and saw the woman who had fought every single day to hold her life together. "I did," he finally said, "and I'd choose you again." That night, after Emma had gone to sleep, Andrew and Sophie sat on the couch, the TV flickering with some show neither of them were really watching. The silence between them had grown comfortable, like the pause between heartbeats. Andrew shifted slightly and looked at her. "I know things have been complicated, and I'm not asking you for anything right now, but I need you to know something." Sophie turned toward him. "I love her," he said quietly. "Emma. Not just in a, she's a great kid way. I love her like she's mine. And I know she's not by blood. But that doesn't matter to me, it never has." Sophie felt her throat tighten, tears stinging before she could stop them. She reached for his hand instinctively, and when their fingers touched, it was like something settled between them, something they'd both been circling for a while but hadn't dared to name. "I know," she whispered. "She knows too." The next morning brought something unexpected. A letter, delivered in a plain envelope, addressed to Sophie in a handwriting she hadn't seen in years. At first, her stomach twisted. Was Derek trying again? Had he found another loophole? But when she opened it, she froze. The letter was from a state prison 2 counties over. The handwriting was undeniably his, but the tone was different, stripped of ego, raw. Derek had been arrested a few weeks after the custody hearing on charges unrelated to Sophie: financial fraud, assault, parole violation. The letter was an apology, though a broken, clumsy one. He admitted to abandoning them, to choosing himself over his family, to only returning when he thought there might be something in it for him. "You were always better than me," he wrote, "and Emma is lucky she got that from you. I thought I was coming back to claim something that was mine, but I see now I never earned it. She's not mine, I'm not hers. Please, don't let her grow up hating me, let her forget me, and let her love whoever's loving her now." Attached was an official notarized statement of full parental relinquishment. It was short and legally binding. He had signed away any future claim, right, or presence in Emma's life, no appeals, no challenges, just an end. Sophie sat at the kitchen table for a long time, letter in hand, the sun rising behind her like a quiet promise. When Andrew arrived later that morning, Emma threw herself into his arms like always. But this time, Sophie didn't just watch. She walked up to them, slid the letter silently into Andrew's hands, and leaned her head against his shoulder. "Looks like we're not borrowing time anymore," she said softly. He looked down at her, then at Emma, who was happily humming to herself and talking about pancakes. "No," he said, "we're building it." Summer arrived slowly that year, stretching into Seattle like a long exhale after a season of holding its breath. The rain softened, the days grew longer, and the light that spilled through the windows of Sophie's little townhouse felt warmer, more forgiving. After everything, the court battles, the fear, the long nights, life had finally settled into something that felt like peace. Not perfect, not without its quiet aches, but real, solid, and most of all, earned. Emma had blossomed. She laughed with her whole body now, unafraid and unguarded, like a child who finally believed the floor beneath her wouldn't disappear. Her drawings covered the fridge. Her shoes were always dirty from the backyard. She'd started calling Andrew Dad without anyone asking her to. One day it just slipped out, mid-sentence, as casually as if she'd been saying it all her life. Andrew had looked up at Sophie when it happened, startled, emotional, but didn't say anything in the moment. Later that night, he had admitted that it was the most important word he'd ever heard someone call him. Sophie was learning, slowly, how to let go of survival mode. For years she had existed in a constant state of tension, ready to run, to fight, to endure. But now, she found herself lingering in bed a little longer on Sundays. She found herself cooking not just for sustenance, but for joy. She let herself laugh more often, and when she looked in the mirror she didn't just see a tired mother. She saw a woman again, a woman who had fought her way through fire and come out stronger. And she saw Andrew standing beside her, every step of the way, never demanding, never pressuring, just there, like sunlight through the trees. It was in the middle of this new, quiet happiness that the letter arrived. It had no return address, just Sophie's name printed neatly on the front. The paper inside was lined, the handwriting familiar in a way that made her chest tighten before she even read the first word. It was from Derek. But not the Derek she remembered, the man who disappeared without looking back, who had reappeared only to cause more damage. This was different. The letter was short, but it carried a weight that pressed against her ribs as she read. He was in prison now, serving a sentence for multiple offenses, some unrelated to her, others that painted a fuller, darker picture of the life he had fallen into. The tone of the letter was stripped of charm. It didn't try to manipulate or provoke, it sounded tired, defeated. Sincere in a way she never thought she'd see from him. He admitted he had failed her. He didn't try to explain or excuse it. "You were good," he wrote. "You tried. I wasn't ready to be a father or a man, and I ran from both. I thought I could come back and take something that wasn't mine anymore, but watching what you've built, even from a distance, made me realize I was never the one who deserved it." The letter continued, describing moments he remembered from when Emma was a baby, her laugh, the way she used to fall asleep holding his finger. "I think about that sometimes, and I feel like I'm holding on to someone else's life," he wrote, "because I let it all go, and now I want to do the only right thing I can." The last page was official, a notarized document relinquishing all remaining parental rights, a final signature with no conditions. Derek had closed the door he had once barged through and locked it himself from the other side. Sophie sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her lap, unable to move for a long time. It was a strange thing, getting what you always wanted from someone you never wanted to need again. There was no joy in the letter, only silence. But in that silence was space, and for the first time in years, that space wasn't filled with fear. She waited to show it to Andrew. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, she handed him the envelope without a word. He read it carefully, eyebrows knitting as he took it all in. When he reached the end, he looked up at Sophie with something like astonishment. "I didn't think he had this in him," Andrew said. "Neither did I," Sophie replied. They sat for a while without speaking. Then Sophie leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "You know what's strange? I always thought I'd feel victorious if this happened. Like I finally won, but I don't. I just feel lighter and a little sad for the man he could have been." Andrew reached across the table and took her hand in his. "That's because you're not bitter. You've been through hell, but you didn't let it make you cruel." Later that week, Sophie told Emma about the letter in the simplest way she could. She didn't read it aloud or talk about prison. She just said that sometimes people realize too late what matters, and that Emma's first dad had made a decision to step away so she could keep living a life full of love. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing it the way only children can, simply and with startling clarity. "So now it's just us?" she asked. Sophie smiled and tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "It's always been us, now it's just more official." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I like our us," she said, "especially with pancakes." They made pancakes that night for dinner, blueberry, Emma's favorite. Andrew showed up halfway through, still in his work clothes, and Sophie handed him a spatula. No one mentioned the letter again, they didn't need to. Days passed, then weeks. Andrew spent more time at the house, quietly slipping into the rhythm of their little world. Sophie no longer hesitated when he reached for her hand in public. Emma no longer knocked before barging into his office at home, climbing onto his lap mid-video call, announcing her presence like she belonged there because she did. One evening after Emma had gone to sleep, Sophie and Andrew sat on the porch, sipping tea and watching the stars appear. The air smelled like grass and warm pavement. Sophie looked over at him, her voice quiet but certain. "I think we're ready," she said. Andrew turned to her, eyebrows raised. "For what?" he asked. She smiled. "To stop holding back, to stop waiting for something to break." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he took her hand, pulled her gently to her feet, and kissed her forehead. "I've been ready," he whispered. And for once, Sophie believed it. All of it. The peace, the love, the life they were finally allowed to build, not borrowed, not fragile, but theirs. Fully, completely, and without fear. The invitation came in a thick, cream-colored envelope, with gold foil edging, tucked among the usual stack of mail filled with grocery store ads and utility bills. Sophie opened it absent-mindedly while standing in the kitchen, wiping pancake batter from her hands, expecting some local church fundraiser or neighborhood newsletter. But as her eyes scanned the elegant lettering inside, her breath caught. It was from the Aurora Foundation, one of the largest children's charities in the region, inviting Andrew Carter and his guests to attend their annual gala. Formal dress. Dinner, silent auction. A night beneath chandeliers and soft jazz. She smiled faintly, unsurprised that Andrew had received an invitation. He was on more than one philanthropic board, and his name alone could fund half the evening. When he came over later that evening, she handed him the envelope with a teasing smile. "Fancy people still want you, apparently." Andrew raised an eyebrow and glanced at the invitation. "Ah, this! I forgot that was coming up. I usually just send a check and skip the social part." Sophie leaned against the counter, arms crossed, a playful look in her eyes. "So you're saying you've never actually gone to one of these?" "Once or twice," he admitted, setting the envelope down. "But it's not exactly my scene. Too many handshakes, too many conversations that sound like interviews." Emma, sitting at the kitchen table drawing a dog with 6 legs and a crown, suddenly looked up. "Can I go?" Sophie laughed softly. "It's not really a kid party, honey." Andrew crouched next to Emma's chair, inspecting her artwork like it was a masterpiece. "Tell you what," he said. "It might not be a kid party, but maybe we could make an exception this year. What if you came as my guest?" Emma's face lit up like a sunrise. "Really?" Sophie looked at Andrew over her daughter's head, her eyes full of amusement and mild suspicion. "You're going to take a 6-year-old to a formal gala?" He grinned. "Only if her mom comes too." That's how Sophie found herself a week later, standing in front of her bedroom mirror in a navy blue dress she never imagined she'd wear again. It had been tucked in the back of her closet for years, a relic of a younger version of herself who used to attend weddings and dinners, back when nights weren't spent in scrubs under fluorescent lights. The dress still fit, surprisingly, and as she adjusted the straps and pinned back a loose strand of hair, she hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. Not because she was trying to look like someone else, but because she had finally stopped hiding the woman she used to be. Emma wore a pale gold dress with a tulle skirt that sparkled in the light, her hair swept up in a bun with a clip shaped like a star. Andrew arrived at their door in a tailored black tuxedo that looked effortless on him, holding a tiny bouquet of white flowers for Emma and a single gardenia for Sophie. He didn't say much when he saw them, just smiled in that quiet way of his, like he was storing the moment in some private part of his heart. The ballroom was breathtaking. High ceilings, warm lights strung above like stars, and long tables draped in ivory linen. A string quartet played in the corner, and waiters passed around delicate hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. Sophie felt out of place for all of 10 seconds, until Andrew slipped his hand into hers and leaned in to whisper, "Everyone's looking at you, you're the most beautiful thing in this room." She rolled her eyes affectionately, but her cheeks flushed. They danced slowly together at first, then took turns spinning Emma around the dance floor, her laughter louder than the music. People watched them with soft smiles, not just because of who Andrew was, but because of the obvious, undeniable warmth between them. This wasn't performance, it was real, and it radiated from the way they moved around each other, effortless, tender, unafraid. As the evening wore on, the charity auction began, and guests returned to their tables. Andrew stood and cleared his throat, asking for the microphone. The room grew quiet. Sophie looked up in surprise he hadn't mentioned any speech. He stood at the front, tall and calm, holding Emma's small hand in his. "Most of you know me as a businessman, or maybe you've read about my company in the news. But tonight I don't want to talk about innovation or market growth. I want to talk about one moment, a moment that changed everything for me." He paused, glancing at Emma with a soft smile. "Not long ago, I passed by a dance school and saw a little girl sitting alone on the steps. She said she didn't have a father to dance with, and I asked if I could be hers, just for that moment. I didn't realize that saying yes to that dance would mean saying yes to everything that followed, to family, to healing, to love I didn't know I could feel again." Sophie's eyes filled as she listened, her heart pounding in her chest. Andrew continued, his voice steady. "Sometimes the people who need us the most aren't looking for big promises or perfect plans. Sometimes they just need us to show up, so this year I'm matching every donation made tonight. Not because it looks good on paper, but because I believe that one small act of kindness can lead to something greater than we ever imagined." The room erupted in applause, but Andrew didn't step down from the stage right away. He looked across the room, straight at Sophie, his voice dropping slightly. "And speaking of imagining more, Sophie, could you come up here for a moment?" The spotlight shifted. A hush fell. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she stood, unsure, her heart hammering as she walked toward him. Emma reached for her hand and tugged her gently forward. When she reached him, Andrew turned to face her, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. "I didn't plan for this to happen here," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "But I realized, I don't want to wait anymore. I've waited through too many silent years. I want this life, with you, with her, forever." He opened the box, revealing a simple but beautiful ring. Nothing flashy, nothing performative, just something true. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Not because we need a title, but because I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life, and I want Emma to never have to wonder who her father is ever again." Sophie's hands were shaking as she reached for his. The answer came so easily, so surely, that she couldn't believe she ever lived without it. "Yes," she whispered. The room erupted into cheers. Emma squealed and threw her arms around both of them. And as the music began again, and Andrew spun Sophie gently into a slow dance, they knew that what had started as a single act of compassion had grown into something unbreakable. Not a rescue, not a fantasy, a family. Real, messy, luminous, and finally whole. The years that followed were not without their challenges, but they were full, the kind of full that comes from a life lived honestly, deeply, with no corners cut and nothing left unsaid. Sophie and Andrew married in a quiet ceremony beneath a canopy of maple trees, with just a handful of people present and Emma standing between them in a flower crown she had insisted on making herself. There were no headlines, no photographers, no designer gowns. Just love, raw and real, binding three people into something that no judge, no DNA test, no court order could ever define. A family born not from blood, but from choice. They bought a house together on the edge of the city, far enough from the noise but close enough to feel connected. It wasn't a mansion, Andrew could have afforded 10 of them, but Sophie had chosen it, and that made it sacred. It had a creaky front porch, a yard full of dandelions, and a kitchen with peeling cabinets that Andrew swore he'd get around to fixing, but secretly loved just as they were. They painted Emma's new room in soft lavender, filling the shelves with her favorite books, and hung fairy lights from the ceiling that stayed on long after bedtime. Andrew still ran his company, but he came home earlier now. He stopped checking emails during dinner. He turned down meetings that bled into weekends. Success didn't look the same to him anymore. It wasn't in stock prices or conference panels. It was in Emma's voice calling him Dad without hesitation. in Sophie's laughter drifting through the house, in the feeling of holding something fragile and knowing he wouldn't lose it this time. One chilly morning in late October, the family welcomed a new addition baby, Oliver, who came into the world screaming and red-faced, demanding attention from the second he arrived. Sophie held him against her chest, exhausted and radiant, while Andrew sat beside her, his arms wrapped around both of them, overwhelmed in a way he hadn't been since that day on the steps of the dance school. Emma, now 8, peeked in shyly and crept to the bedside, staring at her new baby brother with wide, fascinated eyes. "Can I hold him?" she whispered. Andrew helped her settle onto a chair and gently placed Oliver in her arms. She looked down at him with a tenderness so pure it made Sophie tear up. "He's kind of wrinkly," Emma said after a long moment, grinning, "but I like him." Life found a rhythm again, slow mornings with cereal and cartoons, school runs and weekend hikes, late-night feedings and diaper explosions and endless cups of reheated coffee. It was beautiful chaos, the kind Sophie had once been too afraid to hope for. She still worked part-time at the hospital, but now it was her choice, not survival. Andrew's company continued to thrive, but he no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. What mattered most couldn't be measured in press releases or annual reports. Then came the spring recital. Emma had been rehearsing for months. She was one of the older girls now, leading her group through a dance she'd helped choreograph herself. Sophie and Andrew sat in the front row of the auditorium, Oliver asleep in a wrap against Sophie's chest, the lights dimming as music began to fill the room. And then Emma appeared taller now, her bun perfectly in place, her blue dress sparkling just slightly as she moved with confidence across the stage. She was grace in motion, all long limbs and fierce concentration, and for a moment, time stopped. Sophie felt her chest swell with pride, remembering that first dance, that broken little girl in a blue dress, sitting alone on the steps, and the man in the gray suit who chose not to keep walking. When the recital ended, the audience stood in thunderous applause. Andrew wiped his eyes discreetly, then stood and clapped the loudest of them all. Afterward, as the crowd milled around the lobby, Emma came bounding toward them, cheeks flushed, arms wide. "You were amazing," Andrew said, sweeping her into a hug. "Did you see me do the triple spin?" she asked, practically buzzing. "I saw everything," Sophie said. "You shined." But then Emma did something no one expected. She pulled a small folded paper from the pocket of her jacket and handed it to Andrew. "This is for you, I made it in school." He opened it slowly. It was a drawing crayon and marker on construction paper. 3 stick figures stood beneath a banner that read, "My Family." One tall figure in a gray suit, a woman in scrubs, a little girl with a ribbon in her hair, and a baby with a pacifier. All holding hands. At the bottom, in large block letters, it said, "Thanks for choosing us." Andrew knelt down beside her, pressing the drawing to his heart. "You chose me too," he said softly. The moment hung there like a still photograph, pure and warm, and it would stay with them forever. In the years that followed, the story of how their family began was told over and over again at school presentations, bedtime talks, and even once during a podcast interview Andrew reluctantly agreed to do. But no matter how many times it was shared, the heart of it never changed. One day, a man walked past a dance school. One day, a girl sat on the steps, alone, and one sentence, a simple, powerful sentence, rewrote all their lives. "I'll be your dad, for the dance." It had begun with that, and it had become everything. What makes the ending of this story powerful isn't just that it's happy, it's that it's earned. This isn't a fairy tale where a rich man swoops in and fixes everything. It's a story about healing through presence, not perfection. It's about a man who lost everything and didn't try to escape his grief with distractions, but allowed it to lead him towards something real. It's about a woman who carried the weight of survival for years, never asking to be rescued, and still opened her heart again, not out of need, but out of choice. And it's about a little girl whose quiet sadness was transformed, not by grand gestures, but by someone who simply chose to stay. The ending reminds us that family isn't always something we're born into. Sometimes it's something we build slowly, messily, bravely with people who show up when it matters most. That's what makes this story beautiful. Not that everything turns out perfectly, but that everything turns out real, and real is always more lasting than perfect.